You are standing in the wind. It is somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. The exact date does not matter. What matters is this: it is cold. It is dark by mid afternoon. Something large moved through the grass an hour ago and has not moved since. You have no shelter worth naming. You have no fire that will last the night. You have the skin of an animal you killed 3 days ago, and you have draped it over your shoulders because the alternative is to die before morning. Nobody sat down with a plan. Nobody drew a pattern. Nobody said, "This is going to change everything." A human being, cold, bleeding, probably scared, picked up a dead animal's skin and held it against their body. The body stayed warmer. The human lived. That is the whole story. Except it is not the whole story at all. Because somewhere between that first desperate hide, draped over bare shoulders, and the moment when someone threaded a ground bone needle through a piece of fur and pulled a seam closed, something happened to the human mind. Something happened to the human body. Something happened to the idea of what a person was. Welcome to your new life as the first human being who ever got dressed. The body that stopped being covered. Start here. For most of human evolutionary history, you did not need clothes. Your distant ancestors, the ones who walked on 2 legs through the African savanna more than 1 million years ago, were covered in hair. Not the sparse, decorative kind that modern humans carry on their arms and legs. Dense, functional, thermoregulating fur. The kind that kept the sun off during brutal midday heat. The kind that kept the cold out during the night. You did not choose to lose it. It happened slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, in a body adapting to a specific problem: how to hunt large animals over long distances under a hot African sun without overheating and dying. The answer was sweat. Specifically, the development of eccrine sweat glands, millions of them, distributed across the body's surface. Your skin learned to weep. Millions of tiny vents opened across your body, and the heat left through them while you ran. No other large African predator could do this. Lions rest during midday. Dogs pant. You ran for hours until the animal you were following simply collapsed from heat exhaustion. But sweat glands require skin, exposed skin the air can reach. And so, over generation after generation, the dense body hair thinned. The cooling system worked better as the insulating layer retreated. Your ancestors became naked. If all of human history fit into a single day, this hair loss happened across the first 18 hours. Invisible, incremental, irreversible. This was fine in equatorial Africa. Temperatures were manageable. The nights were warm enough. Shade was available. The savanna ecosystem your ancestors had evolved inside had built-in compensations for a thin-skinned primate running in the sun. Then your ancestors started moving. The first major expansion out of Africa, the long, incremental drift of human populations northward and eastward, brought people into environments their bodies had never negotiated. Into the cold steppes of Central Asia, into the wind-scraped plateaus of Europe, into the winters. Here's where the problem becomes visceral. An unclothed human being loses core body heat extremely quickly, in temperatures below roughly 10 degrees Celsius, a cold autumn morning, the kind where you can see your breath. Below 5 degrees, the hands stop functioning properly. Below 0, without shelter and fire, a lean-bodied hominin has hours, not days. The body your ancestors had refined into a long-distance running machine in African heat was catastrophically vulnerable to the cold environments waiting beyond the continent's northern edge. The cold did not wait politely while evolution caught up. Evolution moves in tens of thousands of years. Winters come every year. So the body that had spent hundreds of thousands of years getting rid of its insulation suddenly needed insulation back. But it could not grow that insulation from the inside. It had to go and take it from something else. The something else was already dying around them every season. Animals were everywhere. Animals died. Animals left skins behind. And a human hand that could make a spear could also, with very little modification, pick up a skin and hold it close. That is how it started. Not with ingenuity, with desperation. The technology of staying alive. A raw animal skin draped over a shoulder is not clothing. It is barely better than standing next to a large, warm animal, which your ancestors also did when the opportunity arose. The problem with a raw hide is that it dries stiff. It cracks. When it gets wet, as it will in any environment cold enough to require it, it becomes a refrigeration unit pressed directly against your skin. Below 10 degrees Celsius, wet fur against bare flesh will kill you faster than no covering at all. The thing meant to save you becomes the instrument of your death. So the first technological leap in human clothing history was not sewing. It was not the needle. It was something older, messier, and almost certainly discovered by accident. Someone, not one person, but a technique that emerged independently across many populations over many millennia, found that a hide processed with brains or fat or urine stayed soft when it dried. Imagine being that person. You are holding the hide in both hands. You do not know what you did differently. You only know that this one moves. When you bend it, the surface flexes instead of fighting back. The smell has changed. Still animal, but quieter, less insistent. You press it against your forearm and it conforms. You have no word for what happened. You have no framework for understanding it. You only know it is better than anything you have touched before. And then someone was watching you. Because the hide itself, the softened, workable, wearable hide, matters less than the fact that another person saw what you had done and did it too. And then another and another. Across fire circles and foraging bands and generations of hands that had never met the hands that started it, a technique moved through a population without anyone understanding why it worked. Only that it did. Once you can make a hide stay soft, you can drape it more precisely. You can hold it in place. You can shape it loosely around the parts of the body that lose heat fastest, the core, the extremities. But draping is not shaping, and shaping is the second leap. At some point, the archaeological record places this at around 40 to 70,000 years ago, roughly 20 times longer ago than the pyramids, with suggestive evidence possibly earlier. Someone made a hole in a piece of hide and pushed something through it. The first awl, a pointed bone or stone tool used not to pierce flesh, but to pierce leather. The hole is insignificant. What the hole makes possible is not. A hide with holes can be laced. Two hides with matching holes can be joined at a seam. A joined seam means a garment that wraps around the body instead of merely sitting on top of it. A garment that wraps means trapped air. Trapped air means insulation that the body's own heat replenishes constantly. The difference between a draped hide and a laced garment is the difference between a blanket and a coat. And in the environments your ancestors were pushing into, the frigid periglacial landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Asia, that difference was the difference between surviving the winter and not. Then the bone needle appears. It is one of those objects that deserves more attention than it usually receives. A bone needle is not a blunt instrument. It is precision technology. Someone sourced a bone of specific size and density, ground it to a point fine enough to push through worked leather without tearing, bored a hole through the narrow end without splitting the shaft. That hole, that eye, is a fraction of a millimeter in diameter in some of the earliest examples found. The eye means thread. Thread means a stitch small enough that the seam does not gap. A seam that does not gap keeps wind out. Wind exclusion in a sub-zero environment is survival technology of the highest order. The people who made these needles were not making art. They were making the difference between a living child and a dead one. Every stitch in a child's garment, pulled tight through the eye of a ground bone needle by hands that were probably cold themselves, was a calculation about survival. The calculation worked. The people who learned to sew survived winters that killed those who had not. Their children learned. The technique spread, and then something strange began to happen. Because clothing does something to a body beyond keeping it warm. When the skin became a signal, there is an archaeological site where the body of an adult male was found buried with more than 3,000 ivory beads sewn into the remains of what had been clothing and a headdress. The beads were carved from mammoth ivory. Each one required significant time to shape and perforate. The mathematics of this object, the hours of labor represented by 3,000 individual carved beads on a single set of garments, speak to something that has nothing to do with temperature management. The man was not cold. He was dead and being dressed for something else. This burial, and others like it, marks the moment when the evidence stops being purely functional and becomes something harder to categorize. Because at some point in the deep history of human clothing, and the bone needles and tanned hides and shell beads suggest this happened earlier than it is comfortable to admit, clothes stopped being a technology and became a language. Every human group ever documented across every continent uses clothing and body covering as a system of communication. What you wear tells others who you are, what rank you hold, what group you belong to, whether you are available for marriage or already spoken for, whether you are in mourning, whether you are sacred or untouchable or dangerous. None of this information is thermal. All of it is social. The question of when this shift happened, when the first human being put something on their body, not because they needed it to survive the night, but because they wanted others to see it, cannot be answered with precision. The materials do not survive. Leather rots. Plant fiber disintegrates. Only the processing tools and the decorative elements leave traces. But the traces are there. Ochre, red iron oxide, a pigment, appears at human sites at extraordinary ages. The evidence for ochre use on human bodies goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Ochre does not keep you warm. Ochre on skin is visible from a distance. Ochre is a signal. Shell beads strung on fiber and worn around the neck, some of the earliest portable ornaments found, appear in periods when clothing as a functional system was still relatively new. Someone pierced a shell not because it would keep them warm, but because it would catch the eye of another person standing 10 feet away. The eye-catching is the point. It is the same impulse that eventually produces silk and gold thread and the 3,000 ivory beads of the man in the burial. The impulse that takes a piece of material whose function is to keep the body alive and asks, what else can this do? What else it can do is nearly everything. It can mark a shaman from a hunter, a chief from a commoner, a bride from a widow. It can indicate allegiance. This pattern is ours, that pattern is theirs. It can signal danger. It can indicate the untouchable. It can indicate the sacred. The garment becomes a portable institution. You carry on your body the information about who you are in this social world, where you stand in its hierarchies, what obligations you carry, what protections you are owed. Strip that away, and you strip away identity itself. This is why nakedness, in most human cultures, reads as vulnerability rather than freedom. The exposed body is the body before meaning. The dressed body is the body that belongs somewhere to someone within some structure that has agreed to acknowledge its existence. The clothing did not create this. The social structures existed before the garments, but the garments made the structures visible, portable, impossible to ignore. The evidence hidden in plain sight. The frustrating thing about the deep history of clothing is that the most important evidence does not survive. Leather rots, wool disintegrates. The first garments are gone. What remains are the processing tools, the bone needles, the awls, the scrapers, and the indirect evidence. The beads, the ochre, the burials. But there is one source of evidence for ancient clothing that nobody anticipated. It came from an entirely unexpected direction. Body lice. The human body louse, distinct from the head louse, lives exclusively in clothing. It cannot survive on bare skin. It requires the fabric of a garment to lay its eggs, to shelter, to exist. The head louse and the body louse share a common ancestor. At some point, a population of head lice colonized an entirely new habitat, human clothing. In colonizing that habitat, it diverged. It became a different species. By analyzing the genetic distance between head lice and body lice, working backward through mutation rates to find the moment the two populations split, researchers arrived at an estimate for when clothing became sufficiently regular and sufficiently constructed to support a permanent louse population. The number that emerged was somewhere in the range of 100,000 to 170,000 years ago, roughly 5 to 8 times longer ago than the oldest known cave paintings. Some analyses push the range further back still. The lice, in other words, have a longer memory than the stone tools. This does not mean clothing was universal that early. It means it was sufficiently present in the populations these lice lived on to sustain a breeding colony. Small garments, intermittent use. But garments, real ones, old enough to carry passengers. The louse evidence does something important to the timeline. It pushes clothing back into a period before the major dispersal of modern humans out of Africa. Before the Ice Age conditions most people imagine when they think of the first clothes, before the bone needles. This suggests that the earliest clothing was not purely a response to northern cold. It may have begun in Africa itself, among populations navigating cooler highland environments, seasonal temperature swings, variations in climate that existed even within the continent. The cold of Europe did not invent clothing. The cold of Europe made clothing indispensable. There is a difference. The habit was older. The cold simply selected hard for those who already had it. The point of no return. Once you have clothing, you cannot unlearn it. Not biologically, not culturally. In the biological sense, the human body, over the tens of thousands of years during which clothing became permanent, continued the trajectory it had already begun. The sparse body hair became sparser. Adaptation to external thermal regulation reinforced itself. The biological systems that might have begun restoring body hair under selection pressure did not, because there was no selection pressure. The clothing handled it. The gene variants that produced fuller body hair coverage were not selected for because the individuals who carried them were not dying at higher rates in cold environments. The ones with clothing survived regardless. The result is the modern human body, dramatically under-insulated for the range of environments it inhabits, utterly dependent on external thermal management, unable to survive a northern winter unclothed. The clothing became, in a functional sense, an organ. An organ the body outsourced to dead animals and ground bone and tanned hide, and eventually to factories running 24 hours a day. In the cultural sense, once clothing carries meaning, once it encodes identity and hierarchy and belonging, it cannot be removed without stripping away the information it carries. The dressed body is legible. The undressed body is not. Every society that has achieved any level of complexity above the most basic band structure has developed clothing systems that encode that complexity. The removal of clothing is not neutral. It is, depending on context, punishment, humiliation, liberation, ritual, or death. Never simply the absence of a garment. There are cultures that have historically worn very little clothing by the standards of colder climate societies. But even in those contexts, the small amounts worn or the body modifications applied serve the same communicative function. The information is still there, written smaller, but there. The species crossed a threshold and the threshold closed behind it. Your ancestors who first draped a scraped hide over shivering shoulders were not thinking about any of this. They were thinking about warmth. They were thinking about the darkness outside and the wind coming under whatever counted as a wall. They were thinking about the morning and whether they would be alive to see it. They lived. They stayed warm. Their children learned to sew. And somewhere in the long chain of generations that followed, in the hands that ground bone into needles, in the fingers that pushed ochre into shell beads, in the mind that looked at a piece of tanned leather and thought, this could say something. The species that started by picking up a dead animal's skin became something it had never been before. A species that dressed itself. Here is what the lice know and the textbooks have forgotten. The story of clothing is not the story of cold weather. Cold weather was an accelerant. The story of clothing is the story of a species that looked at its own body and decided the body was not enough, that it needed to be supplemented. Translated into something other people could read from across a fire. They did not start with fashion. They started with a dead animal's skin held against a shivering back in a darkness that had no name for what it was doing. The distance between those two things, survival and vanity, hide and haute couture, desperation and signal, is narrower than anyone would like to admit. Every garment in every closet in the world is descended from that first desperate drape. The cold is still there underneath it. The wind is still there. You have simply learned to name what you are doing. You are standing in the wind. You have been standing there the whole time. That is how it started. We have not stopped since. They were cold first, then they were something else. Most of us have forgotten which came first.